So I'm gonna make this kind of quick, and I know that this is impromptu, so not many people showed up. I'm sorry I didn't stream over the weekend, but I was taking a trip for Memorial Day, so hopefully you can forgive me. But talking about Carl Schmidt's concept of the political, really, really interesting book. It logically extends from this political theology, has a lot of similar themes, and expands on a lot of those themes. So they go together quite well. So what is he exactly trying to accomplish? Well, he's trying to say, what does it mean to be political? What makes something political, and what does this word mean? And this is a very hard thing to do, believe it or not. And it even starts with a definition of the state from his last book and what exactly it means to be sovereign. And you have this initial distinction between this classical versus modern conception of the political. The classical being much more cut and dry. And so here's a quote from the introductory argument. He says, "What is classical is the possibility of unambiguous, clear distinctions, inside and outside, war and peace, during wars, military or civil, neutrality or non-neutrality. All these are recognizably separated and are not intentionally blurred." So the obvious opposition to this is the modern conception of the political, where these lines are very much blurred and there is no clear distinction of friend versus enemy. Or maybe there is, which he is going to go into. But these things are not nearly as vocal and open as they are in this classical conception. You could very much, this is kind of trite, but you could look at, a U.S.-Israel relationship. So they're technically our greatest ally, but they'll also perform acts of war against us, like the USS Liberty. It's not nearly as cut and dry as the friend-enemy distinction is in classical terms. So, going on from this, the very first quote of the entire book, the first sentence of chapter 1 is, "The concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political." So you can't have an understanding of state until you define what it means to be political. So we need to do that first. And so I highlighted the last sentence in the first chapter. He says, "In reality, it is the total state which no longer knows anything absolutely non-political, which must redress the depoliticizations of the 19th century, and, in particular, put an end to the axiom of the state-free economy and economy-free state." So, essentially what he's saying here is, when it comes to the sovereign and the state, everything is political, because the absolute state politicizes everything. Anything that is within the state's power naturally becomes a political topic. And he talks about this in all of these different modes. Your moral becomes the political, your economic becomes the political, your religious becomes the political, your cultural becomes the political. All of these various paradigms are all part of a single political paradigm. You can't have a purely economic view without having it be political. In the same way, you can't have a purely religious view without it being political. So all of these things are naturally going to come and add up to a total state. And so this is probably the most important quote coming from the second chapter, and this is a very well-known quote. You guys may have heard it, but the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be traced is the distinction between friend and enemy. So it's very simple at the surface, but this is actually a pretty profound statement. What is the main distinction between two political entities? It's friend and enemy, and that's it. Like, end of story. Because a lot of people will think that there's going to be some type of reigning principle above that fact. Actually, I believe in some moral standard, therefore I am going to befriend people that follow that standard and make an enemy of those that don't. Well, the truth is, you've already chosen your friend and enemy, and you are going to have different standards for your friend and your enemy. Once you have decided what the line is and where the line is drawn, anybody on one side of the line is your friend and on the other side is your enemy, regardless of any other principle. And you see this very much today, and you can honestly make an entire video about this. I might even do it in the future. But you look at the modern left. People, especially conservatives, love to point out left hypocrisy. How can they how can they want to claim to stop racism, but they're racist against white people? How can they allow BLM to riot and burn down cities and call that peaceful protesting, yet when a bunch of Trump supporters walk into the Capitol building, that's an insurrection, right? It's clearly a double standard, right? And there is no guiding principle. People are going to try to, conservatives try to appeal to some universal morality to try and get the left to admit that they're wrong, but they will never admit that they're wrong because they are operating in this perfectly political paradigm that is those on their side are their friend and anybody else is their enemy. So yes, they are going to have a double standard because the line has already been drawn. And obviously Schmidt has a lot more to say on that, but that's probably the most easiest way to conceptualize this in a modern context. So Schmidt says the political enemy need not be morally evil. He need not be aesthetically ugly. He need not be an economic competitor. It may even seem advantageous to do business with him. He is just the other, the stranger. Right? So once again, he's saying it clearly. There is no overt principle here. Right? There is no guiding principle. It's simply the line has been drawn between friend and enemy, and that's as far as it needs to go for a person to be an enemy. And I'm not going to say that these things don't play a factor. Various aesthetic, moral distinctions, but ultimately they don't matter too much in the very end, right? In the very end, like I said, it's just this contention between two sides, and that is the end-all, be-all. All right, so very long quote here from chapter 3. He says, this is a very interesting thing because he talks about Christianity and the fact that this sort of friend-enemy distinction has always existed, and even when people try to explain it away, they really can't, right? They say this political antagonism is always there, and it doesn't just mean a personal enemy, right? This is not like I just don't like somebody, therefore they're my enemy. No, this is like an existential thing, right? This is you truly have one group against another. In the modern context, you could really just say whites versus blacks, But it also was Greeks versus Persians, 1,000 years or 2,000 years ago. It was Romans versus barbarians, right? These are two different groups, and it doesn't even matter. Maybe a Roman could actually have sat down with. This is, if you read De Bello Gallico, Caesar is very quick to praise the leaders of the Gauls, like Vercingetorix, and he will, talk about how great of a leader he is, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He still wants to kill him just on the existential difference that he's a Roman and Vercingetorix is a Gaul, right? They are it is friend versus enemy. It doesn't matter how great of a leader or good of a man this guy is. He must be destroyed because he is the enemy. So going back to the quote, so he talks about how some people try to twist this and ignore this, but even the Bible is not explaining this away. So he says the oft-quoted passage, "Love thy enemy," which is Matthew 5:4 and Luke 6:27, reads, "Diligite inimicos vestros," and not "diligite hostes vestros." So now if you know your Latin, there's a difference between inimicos and hostes. So hostes is like a political enemy, right? You're the enemy at the gates, the enemy storming, the enemy in war, right? That is what hostes is. Now, inimikos, that is a personal enemy, right? That is a person that has wronged you at a personal level. Your neighbor who lets their dog shit in your yard, right? They might be your enemy, but they are not your political enemy, right? So he says, there is no mention of the political enemy, nor in the 1,000-year struggle between Christianity and Islam has it ever occurred to any Christian that out of love for the Saracens or the Turks, instead of defending Europe, we should hand it over to Islam. One need not hate the enemy in the political sense personally, and only in the private sphere does it make sense to love one's enemy, i.e. one's opponent. That biblical passage has even less to do with political enmity than it does with abolishing, for instance, the distinction of good and evil, or beautiful and ugly. Above all, it does not say that one should love the enemies of his people and support them against his own people. And, this is something that shouldn't even need to be said. I mean, it's quite obvious if you look at historical Christianity that they're quite understanding of this friend-enemy distinction, right? If you just look at the Crusades. But, you have this modern, cuck Christian mentality that just says, love thy enemy, and there, right there. They're not going to elaborate or say any deeper meaning to that. They're just going to say, oh, we need to love everybody and we can never fight. Well, that's just stupid. And that any thinking person knows that that's stupid. And so he says, Schmidt goes on to say, when the party antagonisms within a state become the sole political distinctions, that is when the most extreme degree of domestic political tension is reached, i.e. domestic friend-enemy groupings, and not those of foreign policy, determine the groupings in an armed conflict. So this is a really interesting thing when it comes to, right, civil war. And he says that normally the enemy is anybody outside of your state, outside of your culture, your nation, right? And that makes sense, right? Because they are the other for obvious reasons, culturally, nationally, and just proximally, right? They're not you, right? But as we can see in things like today, these distinctions, they do start to break down. They break down at the domestic level, and soon enough you have this domestic friend-enemy distinction. You have people within your own nation that you're viewing as your enemy, and that is when civil war is going to happen. And if you don't think this is possible, this has happened in every civil war, right, in history, right? And you can see it happening right now. I'm not going to say this is going to lead to a civil war, but once again, you can easily see this friend-enemy distinction being manifested in the modern-day political America, right? You have an actual hatred and fear of the other across the aisle, right? You have, the left that truly hates and fears with a passion your average conservative, right? And the problem is that the left is totally understanding of this distinction, whereas the right will happily deny it and pretend that it doesn't exist. So, I'd say things for the future do not seem to get, they don't seem to be getting any less polarized, that's for sure. Alright, where are we at now? Okay, so then lastly he says, he's talking about people that claim to be, sorry, that's my dog. If people that claim to be not political are just as political as anybody else, and it really comes down to this one quote. So he says, if the will to prevent war is so strong that it no longer shuns war itself, it has become a political motive, i.e. it affirms, if only as an extreme eventuality, war and even the reason for war. At present, this seems to be a particularly promising way of justifying wars, right? So there's two dimensions to this. So the first is that, your actual pacifists, they have no teeth, right? They can actually enforce pacifism without resulting to war, in which case they become political. And if they are truly pacifistic, that they are going to allow war to occur, well, then they're political in the sense that by not fighting against an enemy, they become the enemy, right? And So once again, you cannot be a non-political bystander, right? I think there's, a stone toss comic or something of the nature where it's like, oh, I'm not really into that political thing, and then a gun gets put to their head and they are getting sent to the death camp, right? So everybody, you need to be political. And then ultimately, when he says it seems like to be a good way of justifying war, in order, the idea of avoiding war seems to be the best way to justify war in the modern day. Well, how often do you see this now as the justification for war in the Middle East, right? We need to stop Islamic terror because they're going to take over the world by means of force. And if we don't use means of force to crush them, they're going to crush us eventually, right? And this is how it's going to go for the future. Every single war is going to be justified by avoidance of war. I mean, you can even look at World War II, right? They had to stop Hitler because otherwise Hitler would have declared war on the world. So the world had to declare war on Hitler first, right? They had to get the preemptive strike. So, yeah, once again, good stuff here, and none of it is really disputable. I think it's all very, very accurate. So moving on to chapter 4, this is the very first sentence, so it's very powerful. Any religious, moral, economic, ethnic, or other antagonism will turn into a political antagonism if it is strong enough to effectively group people by friend and enemy. Okay, so once again, I don't necessarily want to contradict myself, but I will say here, right, before I said there is no guiding principle between friend and enemy, but these different identities do create this friend-enemy distinction, right? So once the line has been drawn, any other principle doesn't matter, but the line can be drawn according to a certain principle. So maybe I wasn't clear about that, but like he says, any of these roles, and you've even seen in history, pretty much every single one of these has become strong enough to be a friend-enemy distinction. I mean, the most obvious one is religious, right? How many wars have been fought just off of this religion, I am my religion, we are naturally friend and enemy, we must go to war, right? But then in the 20th century, you saw the evolution of, well, even in the older times, you saw an economic type of conflict, right, between peasants and nobles, or even now, right, you see the proletariat versus bourgeois, right? That's the 20th century evolution of that. Then lastly, ethnic. How many ethnic wars have been declared? You could even say, Greeks versus Persians. Was that not an ethnic war? I mean, pretty much was. So yeah, all of these things are what lead us to conflict, essentially, if they are a strong enough identity, and therefore all of these are political. They are a political identity because it arises in a friend-enemy distinction, and anything that does that is going to be political because it leads to conflict, right? And this political conflict is the ultimate decider of friend versus enemy. So then he says, the political entity is precisely, by its very nature, the authoritative entity, no matter from what force it draws its ultimate psychological motives. It exists or it does not exist. If it exists, it is the highest, i.e. the decisive entity in the decisive case. Now, just to call out Satanta for what he was saying, he was sort of saying that the state cannot possibly be absolute, as what he was saying, as what Schmidt was saying earlier on with political theology, right? He used this quote that all states are absolute. And Satanta had a issue with this. He says, well, you could have very many varying forces that could pressure the state and exert power over the state. And that is true, but what is the decisive entity, right? What is the ultimate decider and the final say in any of that? That must be the state, right? So the state is the authoritative entity. And therefore he says, right, the political entity is precisely by its nature the authoritative entity. So the state being the political entity, and that's why you can't describe the state without describing the political. So this last part, if it exists, is the highest, right? Which means if there is something that is exerting pressure on the state so that the state is not final, well, then that other entity is thus the state, right? So if you make the argument, well, the U.S. government is beholden to the central banks, that doesn't necessarily mean that the state is not absolute. It just means that the U.S. government is not the state, right? The central bank, since they are the ultimate political entity, they are the true sovereign, right? So that opens up a whole new can of worms, but it's just an interesting type of argument to make, right? To say that this is, once the sovereign is challenged so much, it is not the sovereign. But I say that there's really, once again, I could not dispute that. It makes a whole lot of sense to me. All right. So moving on to chapter 5, he says, if a people fears the toils and risks of a political existence, another people will relieve it of these toils by taking over its protection against external enemies, and thus its political rule. The patron then determines the enemy by virtue. Yeah, this political existence, everything has to be political. You can't be apolitical, right? If you're going to be a neutral entity, you're going to either have to fight for your personal sovereignty or be taken over by another entity, right? And you could be benevolent or it could be aggressive, but either way, you are now going to be beholden to this patron, right? Your protector is then going to be the one to draw the line of friend and enemy, and then you're going to be expected to fight in that case, right? So is it possible to be truly politically neutral? Ultimately, no, right? For these very reasons. So maybe you could have something like Switzerland, which is sort of allowed to exist as a neutral state by everybody else, right? But if there was going to be some total war, that could change at any point, as long as its patrons, right, the protectors of that nation, were to just draw the line and say, no, you need to fight for us now, or else you are the enemy, right? So it can only exist as a neutral state by virtue of its protecting states. So then he goes on to say, if parties within a state are able to provide their members with more protection than the state becomes at best an annex to these parties, and the individual citizen knows whom to obey. So now, once again, this is sort of how a civil war type scenario arises, right? So he's saying exactly that if you have one entity inside the state that is actually protecting you and giving you the protection, then that is going to be your new sovereign, right? Because who protects you is going to be the one that has declared the friend-enemy distinction, right? So you can see sort of something when this could be a problem with private police forces, right? So if we do abolish police and create a private police force, well, now you are no longer really beholden to the state for anything. Now, the state is the one the private police force is the one protecting you. They essentially become your state, and you are beholden to them, right? You are going to give them your tax burden, and then ultimately you're going to give them your loyalty, right? If there is going to be some type of civil conflict, who do you owe your loyalty to? The state that has abandoned you, or the private police force that is actually protecting you? So once again, this political entity is also who is providing this personal protection and saving you from a friend-enemy distinction. So then he goes on to say, just because a people no longer has the strength or the will to remain in the sphere of the political does not make the political disappear from the world. Only a weak people disappears. So he talks about this in relation to anybody that is going to try to abandon this concept of the political and try to think that there could possibly be a world peace, a truly politics-free world, right? If you could, the only way you could do that is by abandoning all of these identities, right? We said the moral, aesthetic, ethnic, cultural, economic, right? If you could possibly create some utopia without those, that you would abandon conflict. Well, really, even if you could do that, it's not true, right? All you're doing is renouncing conflict, and the people that are willing to declare a friend-enemy distinction, they are going to overtake you. They are going to become the political entity, and you are just going to disappear. It's once again very hard to argue with that, right? It's just purely pragmatic politics. And so now going into that was chapter 5. Chapter 6 was interesting, didn't have a whole lot in there I wanted to share. And then I had one quote from chapter 7. So he says, accordingly, the strange and for many certainly disturbing observation remains that all genuine political theories presuppose man as evil, i.e. not at all unproblematic, but as a dangerous and dynamic being. So this is a really interesting thing that sort of goes into a totally different direction. But the idea of a state, right, it already presupposes that a man cannot fend for himself and be moral by himself, right? You need to have some type of civilized structure in order to keep man in check. And many people will try to explain that away, but ultimately, if man were perfectly good, there would be no use for a state. And while some people still believe this, right, your radical libertarian or anarchist types, it is just a fact of life that this is not true, right? So we could honestly say that, yes, man is evil, and because of that, there's going to require a state. So it's he goes in to say that pretty much every political philosopher agrees with this to some degree. Everybody from Machiavelli to de Maistre, right? And he even says, Hobbes, right? Very much so. And it was only until like Rousseau you kind of get to this like noble savage idea that man is inherently good, and the state is subtracting from that. But even Rousseau doesn't really take that to its extreme the same way that your anarchist does. So most people are in more or less agreement that the man does require a state because he is not perfectly good on his own. So then lastly, in chapter 8, he says, for the individual as such, there is no enemy with whom he would have to fight to the death if he personally did not want to. To force him to fight against his will is in any case, from the private individual's point of view, unfreedom and violence. All liberal pathos turned against violence and unfreedom. Every impairment, every threat to individual unlimited freedom, private property, and free competition is called violence, and is eo ipso something evil. What this liberalism of state and politics still accepts is limited to securing the conditions of freedom, to eliminating the disturbances of freedom. So he talks about how this has been a pretty destructive, that the entire political paradigm has been shifted towards liberalism, because now the liberalism is the paradigm. Liberalism, anything that is illiberal is naturally an enemy, right? The friend-enemy distinction has sort of been created by this liberal versus non-liberal paradigm. And also because of that, the liberal paradigm sees itself as beyond the political. It kind of sees itself as self-evident, and it's no longer just one way of looking at things. It's no longer one ideology. It is the single correct way of functioning, and anything besides this must be stamped out and destroyed. And in this case, it once again uses this ultimate justifier of war, right? War is justified in the way that it can prevent war, right? So once you're in this liberal paradigm, right, it is any type of conflict is necessary for the purpose of freedom if we're destroying something that is anti-freedom. And in that same way, you can use that to justify pretty much any type of conflict, right? In the same way you see it now going on in the Middle East, right? People talking about Islamofascism. It must be stomped out because they are an enemy to freedom. Or, any type of domestic ethno-nationalist, right? It must be stomped out because they are a threat to this liberal conception of freedom. Quite interesting and quite damning on how this has totally shifted this political dynamic. And then he goes on to say, thus the political concept of struggle becomes in liberal thought competition on the economic side and intellectual debate on the other side. Instead of a clear distinction between the two different statuses of war and peace, the dynamics of eternal competition and eternal discussion take over. Right, so now that you have secured the liberalism as the reigning ideology, all that's left is to discuss economics, right? So they said that this liberalism boils down all politics to an economic discussion, and it was like this for a long time. You really just had the right-leaning capitalists versus the left-leaning socialists, and everything else was sort of tangential to that, right? You had some cultural debates, but ultimately the only thing that people cared about were this economic issue, right? How high are my taxes going to be? And it's only nowadays that you're starting to see that shift to less of a concern with economics and more of a concern with things like culture and identity, which you could say is a breakdown of the liberal paradigm, right? You could say that this liberalism is starting to be dethroned as this reigning ideology, which has very severe implications, but nonetheless is very interesting to note. And we might see some very big changes down the line because of this. So that was the last note I had on Schmidt. So ultimately, really like this, and I think understanding of this friend-enemy distinction and how this is the single paradigm that drives the political. This is a type of thing that everybody needs to internalize and take with them, because you are not going to be afforded any level of fairness or equal treatment because you are an enemy, right? And until you realize that you are an enemy and this line has been drawn, you can't appeal to anything like hypocrisy. You can't appeal to a universal standard. The standard is that they hate you and that you are going to be destroyed at all costs. So therefore, this is going to become a more severe battle, right? This is going to be an existential battle for your existence as an enemy. So once again, Schmidt, very sober take, very real. I'd say, besides Machiavelli, is there anybody that is willing to put politics in such clear terms, right? In such, not beating around the bush, not taking any kind of moralistic stance, but just saying this is how it is, and you need to accept this. And it's not all, not everything is ideological, right? Sometimes it really just comes down to identity. And people talk about, how much they hate identity politics, whereas other people are intelligent enough to say that all politics is identity politics, and this basically proves that, right? The identity is whether you're a friend or whether you're an enemy, and while that can be a line drawn through various different reasonings, it ultimately exists as an identity, and you are going to be a friend or an enemy. Therefore, you need to accept that and be ready to fight, right? Well, once again, thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll be back this Sunday, and we can talk about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Hopefully get through about half of that. So thank you very much. I will see you soon.